Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Gary's webinar on why players suddenly experience a catastrophic loss of form, brought to you by Cereplast in partnership with BASRAT. So before we start, we'll just run through some housekeeping rules. Please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. It is always really nice just to see where everyone is from in the world, all of the different professions that we have with us today. So today's webinar will take us around 40 minutes. And then we'll have time for any questions that anyone has for Gary. Please do pop them in the Q&A box throughout the presentation. If you do see questions that you'd also like answered, you can upvote these, which just lets us know the most popular questions and which ones to get to first if we do have a big influx. And then finally, everyone does get a certificate for today's webinar, and there will be a recording which Gary has consented to. So no need to email us. We will send a link and the certificate over the next few weeks. So for those that are new to these webinars and don't know much about BASRAT, I will just give a brief overview on who we are and what we do. So we're the professional association and regulator for sports rehabilitators and trainers. We provide regular CPD webinars for our associate members and registrants. So if you are in a healthcare profession and you're interested in being an associate member, then please feel free to get in touch. There's £5 a month and you can see the benefits on the screen there that you get from being an associate member. Thank you all for joining today. I hope everyone enjoys the webinar. A big thank you to Gary for giving up his time this evening. And I will just hand over to Andrew from Cereplast to do a brief intro as well.
Thanks, Serena. Evening, everyone. Thanks very much, Gary, for kindly giving up your time. And I'll just quickly do a quick introduction to us. So I work for Cereplast Healthcare, and our sport division, Cerasport, is essentially where we supply medical consumables to our customers and partners in sports. So the whole range of different items, as you can see from the list there. We're really pleased to work in partnership with a whole range of different sports teams, from grassroots all the way up to professional level, with different governing bodies and organisations, and with sports injury professionals and rehabilitators too. You can use that code to get a discount on the Cerasport website. And for those of you that are interested or go into the Therapy Expo, you can get 20% off your ticket price with the code there. If you could just move on, Serena. So the Injury Rehab Network, apologies to those that have heard this before, was started in 2019, and it was a local forum for partners and those that are working in sports medicine, sports injuries around the Northwest where we're based, just to give them a platform to share ideas and collaborate. During lockdown, we're obviously unable to host those events on a face-to-face basis, so we've been really pleased to be working with BASRAT to take the events online, and we've now been running a combination of online and face-to-face events. But really pleased that we've had a fantastic range of expert guest speakers talking around a whole range of different guest topics. And obviously the events are only possible by people joining and contributing to them. So it's really good that we continue to get such good engagement from all of the BASRAT members and other people that are getting involved. So please do spread the word and continue to keep getting involved. If you've got any ideas for future guest speakers or topics, please do let us know as well. So the event details are on the web link there. You can register interest for our next event in December about sporting facial injuries with Professor Ian Hutchison, and we've already got a pretty good programme confirmed for 2023 with a whole range of different topics, as you can see there. So again, please do have a look and register your interest in those events. So I hope you enjoy Gary's presentation, and thanks very much for joining. And yeah, thanks again, Gary, for kindly giving up your time. We'll Serena and I will mute and turn our cameras off now, but as Serena said, please do post questions in the Q&A box as Gary's talking.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Serena and Andrew. I'm just looking at the chat box. Sarah Richards, Chiropractor UK. Hello, hi everyone. Please make sure you change the to everybody rather than join us and panelists. Right. So I'm a psychotherapist, and it's with great regret and shame, I would say, that as far as I know, I'm the only psychotherapist in the village, the only sports psychotherapist embedded in first team football in the UK. I work with Oxford United, but I work with lots and lots of clients as well, football agents, football managers, as well as other sports who are looking for that extra little bit of something or other that their players are not quite achieving. That's when you're looking to increase the level of performance. We're looking today at why players have a catastrophic loss of form. Well, the simple answer is there are lots of reasons, and I'm going to split my presentation in two. You'll probably realize that there's no PowerPoint presentation. The joke about PowerPoint, which I was sharing before, was PowerPoint, if there's no power and no point, what's the use? What's the point in using PowerPoint? So I don't see any point in using PowerPoint, hence I'm just talking down the barrel of the camera. So I'm going to have two aspects to my talk. And the first one is more of a sports psychology theory of why players would have a catastrophic loss of form. And the second part of my presentation is more a home game for me, which would be the psychotherapist view. I might just angle it more towards a psychotherapeutic view rather than the sports psychology view. Quite simply, I'm not qualified as a sports psychologist, although many of the practices of sports psychology are known to me, and I do use some very well-trusted techniques to help players get through difficult times. So we're looking at players who suddenly, out of nowhere, lose it. And I'm going to start with a little bit of science, if I may. Great to see 95 participants, by the way, and people joining from Canada, and Declan, sports therapy person from Leeds, my hometown. Little bit of science, first of all, which I'm sure many of you will know, but if you were to look at the human brain and we were to divide it up into two of the main components, this is really important when you look at the sporting aspect. We are looking at the older part of the brain, which is the limbic part of the brain, and we're looking at the prefrontal cortex, the neocortex, which is the more modern part of the brain. And we need to understand this if we're going to understand why players have a catastrophic loss of form. This goes right across my presentation. Dr. Steve Peters wrote the book, The Chimp Paradox, which is all about this, the naughty chimp being the limbic part of your brain, and the prefrontal cortex, the neocortex, is kind of the computer. You might say, well, how do we know they exist? Well, we can do very simple examples of how we know they exist. If I were to say to you, what is 100, take away 50, and the answer, of course, is 50, that is done by the neocortex. You can't ask your cat to do that sum, or your dog to do that sum, or a 2-year-old child to do that sum, because the area of that brain is not developed. So that's the human part of the brain, the computer bit of the brain, but we're going to look at the limbic part of the brain. That is the part of the brain which keeps us safe. Because if it hadn't been developed hundreds of thousands of years ago, that we would get fearful when we heard the tigers roar outside the cave, if we didn't get fearful and do something about it, we'd be the tiger's lunch. And what happens in sportsmen and women today when there's no obvious physical threat to their environment is not that dissimilar. Because what happens is, supposing a player is unhappy or not doing well, or a striker hasn't scored a goal in 5 or 6 weeks, they begin to start thinking from that area of their brain. They can't engage the computer bit of their brain, which would be saying, look, you might haven't scored for 3 or 4 games, but you'll be scoring the next game. They start this internal monologue of, I'm never going to score, I'm never going to score, I'm never going to score. The limbic part of the brain produces 3 essential reflexes. the fight reflex to get ready to fight, the flight reflex to run away. I've had that flight reflex about 5 minutes ago before I was being introduced, because I'm thinking this is going to be really scary. But the bit we're going to look at is the freeze response, whereby you just freeze like a rabbit in the headlights. And what this looks like on a football pitch or a sports pitch is players who are playing with fear. And you can often see this coming through on tactical analysis, when all of a sudden, instead of driving forward in a positive way, they're looking sideways or they're looking backwards. And if you think about young players, for example, people who are spending their time in our football academies, the last thing they need after having this part of their brain aroused is for a coach or a parent or a manager to have a go at them, because it will make it even worse. And when we get into that state, when we're being shouted at, we're being criticized, the limbic part of our brain freezes even more. So one of the reasons that players have a catastrophic loss of form is they might just be unlucky for a couple of games, and then all of a sudden the criticism comes. And it's not just the criticism, as you know yourself, of the manager or the coach, it's the fans, it's social media, it's just about everybody. So all of a sudden, the belief is there that everybody's looking at them. You might have been to that dinner party where you suddenly become self-conscious. Well, if you haven't scored a goal in 6 or 7 games, and you've got 70,000 people wondering if you're going to score, that sharp intake of breath as you head into the penalty area, that is going to affect you. That idea, that the belief, what I would call the internal belief, it's not going to happen again. We all suffer from that, by the way. It's part of our human psyche. This isn't going to happen. I'm not going to get that job. I'm not going to pass this exam. That girl or boy is not going to say yes when I ask them out. There's 101 ways of it manifesting itself. I'm not going to get that raise when I go see the boss. And what I work with players, when I talk to them about this internal monologue, this internal belief system which they have, is remember when you were learning to ride a bicycle when you were younger, and the person teaching you to ride the bicycle said, if you look at the ground when you're riding a bicycle just over the handlebars, that's where you'll end up, on the floor. And it's the same with our athletes and players. If you have an internal belief system, you will believe it, because that is something that we are feeding the whole time. I'm going to just jump sideways into a little story I often tell some of the footballers I work with, about a chief from an Inuit tribe who was sitting by the river, and his grandson comes to see him, and he said, "Grandpa, you're looking so worried for the last few days. What's the problem?" And his grandfather said, "You know, grandson," he said, "there are 2 wolves who are fighting for my soul, who are inside me the whole time." He said, "There's a good ass wolf who's kind and thoughtful and respectful and empathic, and is always looking out for me and my family. But there's a badass wolf who is mean and nasty and revengeful and is not a good wolf at all." And the little boy says to him, "That's interesting, Grandpa. Which wolf wins inside you, these 2 wolves who are fighting you for your soul?" And the grandfather says, "That's easy to answer. It's the one that you feed." And that's what we do inside a football club. We help players to not feed the badass wolf, the wolf that doubts their own ability. We try and feed the good wolf. And I'll say to anybody on this call, and there are now 102 people on this Zoom link, think of your own lives. If you're going through a tough time, what are you feeding? What belief system are you feeding? That I'm no good at my job, or I can't pass an exam, or I won't find somebody who will love me one day? That's the badass wolf. And we have to stop. We have to interrupt that belief system that those players in our clubs, our academies, our first teams sometimes get in their heads round. I'm never going to score. I'm never going to do this. I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to play first team football. Most of my clients, are people who can't get in the first team. Tell me what I need to do to get in the first team. I'm working with a Premier League player at the moment, and I can't tell you which Premier League club, and I can't tell you which player because of confidentiality, but this guy, we started working again the week before last, and he says, manager's a muppet. Manager is an utter muppet. He said, none of the lads respect him. There's nothing about football. Our formations are, insert rude word here, we're absolutely, all the lads hate him. And I said to this player, I said, does the manager, very famous football manager, know that you don't respect him? He goes, yeah, 100%. I said, what message are you giving to him on a daily basis? He goes, don't know. He said, every time you walk in your training ground, you are giving that manager an excuse not to play you on Saturday. And this is a player who came to me because he couldn't get in the first team. And he goes, yeah, but I said, starting tomorrow, we are going to change the perception of you inside your football club. He said, how are we going to do that? I said, perception in psychology is everything. So if the perception is you're enjoying yourself and you're happy, the manager will have faith in you. He says, well, can you give me an example? So I said, do you have a domestic pet? Do you have a dog? He goes, yeah, I have a dog. So I said, does your dog worry about what happened yesterday or the day before or last week or last year? And he goes, no. I said, does your dog worry about what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next month? He said, no. I said, what does your dog worry about or have put his attention on? And he said, the dog and all domestic pets only have their attention on now. And I said, you need to be more like your domestic pet. Go in there, enjoy the now, forget about the past, which is often associated with depression. Forget the future, which is often associated with anxiety, and live in the now. And when players don't live in the now, they often can suffer a huge loss of form. So I'm just going to touch on a few other sports psychology pieces which I think are interesting, why players suffer a catastrophic loss of form. There are other reasons as well, which might not be psychological, but can have a very important impact on a player. The first thing I'm going to mention is fatigue, which often happens around February, March time. Early spring, when players might have played 50 games or so. If you think about an international, he might play 60 games a season. He might be traveling 4 or 5 hours by aeroplane if he's playing European football. And there's an enormous pressure on him. So fatigue is often one of the reasons why players suffer a catastrophic loss of form. In the Premier League and the Championship, they are well-funded clubs. And very often to try and get around this problem, at some stage over the Christmas period, and of course we're having a break in the Champ and Premier League when the World Cup is on, players might be sent to a warm weather camp so for training, so they might get good levels of vitamin D, they might reset the mindset of the group, and the physicality of the team might be just tweaked a little bit. So there are ways around this, but fatigue can play a huge part. Just imagine what you're like when you're fatigued. What kind of mood are you in at home? What kind of mood are you in with some other, with your nearest and dearest and your work colleagues? Hello, Neve, sports therapy student in Leeds. I'm just having a quick scroll down. Good to see everybody. Milton Keynes, Leeds, and of course we talked about Canada. Good to see so many people on the call. Thank you. The Football Association talk about the 4 pillars of excellence. They're being technical, tactical, physical, and psychosocial. And when these change, if a team changes its formation, or changes something technical or tactical, you do sometimes find that certain players will suffer a catastrophic loss of form. For example, if you're playing 5 midfield players and a striker, it's going to be very different than playing 4 midfield players and 2 up front. So if most footballers I've ever come across who are strikers will say they prefer to play with a fellow striker rather than shoulder the sole responsibility of scoring goals for a football team. So change of the system could cause a catastrophic loss of form. Physically, as we've mentioned, and the fatigue that causes, and also playing with injuries. Players will not always be that open about how injured they are when they're going into big matches. So that gives you a flavour of some of the sports psychology elements where players feel that they are not playing at their best. I'll just give you a few workarounds, a few things that I often will talk to a player about when he is when he or she are not scoring goals or not playing well. One of the first things I would mention to them, and it's interesting we use Sterasport very kindly supporting this presentation. I often suggest to players that they put a message to themselves on a strapping around their wrist. And if you look at my club, Oxford United, you'll see this, the players put some strapping around their wrist and they write messages to themselves. Now, you might say, why they're writing messages to themselves? Well, because the limbic part of the brain, the bit that's the emotional center of the brain, can get highly aroused during a match, and you can forget what you're meant to be doing or why you're meant to be doing it. So we have a player, a Spanish player at our club, who tends to just lose focus in the middle of games, and he has the word vamos, or V-A-M-O-S, which means let's go in Spanish, written on his bandage around his wrist. So you can bring in the neocortex in the middle of a football match, because the neocortex is all about language, mathematics, it's the computer. We can do this hack where we bring our attention back to the prefrontal cortex and remind yourselves what you should be doing. I mean, you often find that at the end of football matches, how many times do teams chasing a game and a 1 down with 10 minutes to go have a player sent off? Because this over-arousal descends on the players and they're not thinking properly. And somebody will come in for a rash challenge, 5 minutes to go, get red carded, and all of a sudden an impossible situation becomes a really impossible situation. So the idea of engaging the prefrontal cortex during a match is really important. The other thing I might suggest to players is they read an advertising hoarding on the side of the pitch, because the language can often bring them back into the here and now. Prefrontal cortex can get carried away with itself, especially if you're worrying and anxious about what's going on. So those are a few ideas and a few things I would suggest to players. Be the dog, be the now, be in the moment, be like your pet, and try and remember to bring yourself back into the moment. A piece of language, a reset. Sometimes I'll say to players, play to the referee's whistle. What I mean by that is each time the referee blows his whistle, it's almost like a restart for a player to then start all over again, because many players find it very, very tiring to concentrate for 90 minutes. If you split it down into just 3 or 4 minute segments, or every time the whistle goes, there's a restart point, a restart point, a restart point. I worked with a player who just used to switch off psychologically, and I worked with him a lot in restarting his brain again, restarting his psyche again every time the referee blew his whistle, because his manager was complaining that, say, on throw-ins or free kicks, he just switched off and he wasn't picking up his marker like that. So a little bit now about the other side of the equation. Now that we've talked about the psychology side, this is the psychotherapy side. And I unashamedly will bring this into the presentation, which is my book about my work as a sports psychotherapist, published by Penguin in February 2021. And these are tales of different sports people who have been to see me. They're all all the facts and characteristics of the people I've worked with have been anonymized, so I've had to be very careful about how I describe some of these individuals, but I use players from different sports. There are footballers, rugby players, cricketers, there's a jockey in there, there's a women's footballer in there, there's a snooker player in there. But if you are interested about my work and what the sort of work is of a sports psychotherapist, here's one I made earlier. Here's a book I wrote last year. Anyway, so what do I do? Well, if we think about sports psychology of being on the field issues, sports psychotherapy is off the field issues. And we are really, really bad, I think, worse than other sports, in fact, at recognizing when players are struggling. Let me ask you this question. Hi from Dubai, by the way, Sophie, sports therapist from Homefirth. Nice that you could join us. Let me ask you this question. Imagine you in your life. I'm guessing you have people around you who love you, care about you, maybe parents, you live with mum and dad, or you live with your partner or whatever. Imagine one day somebody came into your life and said, as what happens in the football world, on transfer deadline day, you're about to go onto the other side of the planet, into a country you don't know, speaking a language you don't know, living in a city you don't know, with no friends, no loved ones, nobody. And you're going to have 70,000 people maybe judging you on how you do and how you do it. How would you cope? Because I don't think I do very well. I rely on the support of my loved ones, my family, people I care about, my friends, people I can pick the phone up to. I know Zoom makes things much, much easier, but really we're asking our players to do an awful lot. And when they come to these clubs, although there are player welfare roles inside our football clubs, the psychotherapeutic support we offer those people is very, very limited. The off the field, the soft skills. And they are highly unlikely to come to their new club and say, you know what, I'm struggling. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm playing in a position I've never played before. I'm playing with individuals I don't know. They're speaking a language I don't know. I'm not surrounded by my family or my friends. And although clubs are getting better at creating player welfare roles, it's still a long, long way off, because the mental health implications for what I've just suggested are enormous. They are, for somebody living on their own or being in a hotel room 24/7, or the mental health implications of the solitude is going to be very, very taxing on any individual who comes to a new club. So we're really poor at that still. We still don't quite understand the stresses and strains that we're putting on our brightest and best. An example, I would say there are several examples of players. Alexis Sanchez would come to mind. Didn't settle at Manchester United, found it very hard, wrong club, wrong time, went to Arsenal, did very well. He talked about the stresses and strains of being at a different club, different country, parents not with him, family not with him. So those are the kind of examples I would say, why aren't we supporting our clubs? There is a really interesting debate which goes like this. Do you put somebody like me as a psychotherapist embedded into a football club, or do you keep me outside a football club on a panel of experts where people could ring me up from several football clubs? There are pluses and minuses to both, to be honest. It's neither, one is not right and the other's not right, or the other's wrong. There are arguments both ways. Let me give you the arguments. If I am embedded in a football club, there is a very strong case that players often make about roundabout confidentiality, because they might fear that as soon as I know something about them, I'll run to the manager, and they'll have every right to be worried about that, because my manager at my football club will say, how do you know that? Or who have you been speaking to? And I have to say, I can't tell you that. And it's a pressure that I'm placed under just about every week. If I sit outside the football club, it's much, much harder for players to reach outside because they don't know who I am. They've never met me. Interestingly, I was working with an international player who played for a Premier League club, and I went up to visit him in the north of England, and we sat down opposite each other. Excuse me. And he said to me, I said, do you have any questions? The first question he asked me is, how do I know I can trust you? He says, how do I know that whatever I say to you will not be taken straight to the papers? Because stuff I often say to my physio or my people I work with ends up on social media. Isn't it sad that our best and brightest footballers have that belief that anything they say will be monetized or turned into social media fodder? In my work inside a football club, I am looking for subtle changes that can be very obvious to me when I'm looking at players. And what I mean by that is I'm looking for the player who sits on his own in the staff canteen and eats his lunch on his own. Is he being integrated into the group? How do I help that for him? I can't go and knock on his door and say, you know what, it doesn't feel like you're integrating into this group. What's the matter with you? It has to be a different format. It has to be a different question. So I'm looking for subtle changes, but I'm also interacting with different departments. The S&C, strength and conditioning department, the medical department, the sports performance department, the rehab department, the recruitment department. And those people feed information into me to help me understand a much wider concept of what's going on inside the football club. It's not easy, because sometimes when you say to players, are you okay? They'll say, yeah, I'm fine, because ultimately they don't want to admit their vulnerability. This is the biggest problem I would say I have in my role as a psychotherapist inside a football club. Nobody wants to be vulnerable. There is a very famous business psychologist called Patrick Lencioni, Lencioni, Patrick Lencioni. And he talks about the 5 dysfunctions of a team. He wasn't talking about a football team, by the way. He was talking about any team in business, but it's equally applicable, to be honest. And the first dysfunction of any team, Lencioni said, or Lencioni, is trust. Now, it's not the trust that you will arrive at training at the right time, or that you will do what you say you're going to do as a footballer or as an employee of a football club. It's the trust that that person has to be able to say, I don't know what I'm doing. I think we're doing this wrong. I think we need to think again about this. Now, without that trust, people clam up. They keep their mouths shut. They don't say anything. And I'd say this to everybody on this call, and there are now 105 people on the call, on this webinar. Go back to your organizations. If you're working with teams, you're working with players, you're working with athletes, and ask 1 or 2 of them, are you able to say, I think the coach has got this wrong, or coach, I think you've got this wrong. We are not going to be successful. Because if the coach says, shut up, you don't know what you're talking about, that clams players up. And when players clam up, you will find there is a very strong result to that, which is a loss of form. Because when players stop being expressive, when players stop doing what they do best, you can see a whole range of psychological problems, which almost like a virus, like flu or COVID, just wash through the team. And that is when you have a catastrophic loss of form, because players say, for example, we're playing 3 at the back, we haven't got the players to play 3 at the back. And if people aren't honest enough to the manager and say, I'm sorry, this isn't working for me, you don't stand a chance. So one of the most important things is trust. And how much trust is there inside your organization when things are not going well? Are there people in your organization who are able to say, I think this is not right? Or do I have to put up and shut up, which has been historically the culture in our football clubs? When we are allowed to tell each other, I'm having a hard time, I'm going through a bereavement, I'm going through a marriage breakup, I'm going through a relationship breakup, I have problems with my mum and dad. When those sort of messages get filtered back, it all begins to make sense to the people who are running that organization. I worked with a player who was having a really tough time at his club. When we worked out what was really going on, it was all about his mum and dad. Dad had given up his job because his son was earning so much money playing football, and Dad followed the son around the country. Every football match, wherever he played, from up in the northeast all the way down to the south coast, Dad would go. And the kid would be absolutely terrified of letting his dad down, because when he was coming through the junior teams and academies, his dad would give him one hell of a rocket every time he played badly. We suggested, or I worked with this player, and I suggested that it might be a good idea to ask Dad to stay away. Can't tell Dad to stay away, he'd be upset, it would hurt his feelings. I said, whose career is this? Is it yours or is it your dad's? So there are so many different aspects of the psychotherapeutic world whereby footballers and players of different sports suffer all the same insecurities that you and I suffer, except they're not allowed to say anything, except they have to do it in the public eye. They have to do it in front of 70,000 fans. You know, I have bad days as a psychotherapist, but nobody's looking over my shoulder. Nobody's writing stuff on social media about me. Nobody's asking me, why did I do what I do? And ultimately, I do the best I can do on any given day. And I'll have good days and I'll have bad days. And we have to be much, much kinder to our sports stars, that they too might have good days and they too might have bad days, when for inexplicable reasons they suffer a catastrophic lack of form, and they haven't got trained mental health professionals like myself to talk to, and they've got nowhere to take this stuff. Are you surprised that they sometimes are not the best version of themselves when they put on their boots? And I think I'll leave it there for the time being. I was asked to do 40 minutes and I'm done 39 minutes exactly. So I'll open up the floor to any questions you have about any of the work I do. I can't give away any trade secrets in terms of football clubs or tell you which players I work with, except I am the psychotherapist at Oxford United. I'm happy to share that because it's public knowledge. But the rest of my work with other sports and other teams, I have to keep confidential. But I'm happy to talk about in general any of my work.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gary. I'll read some of the questions. I think we've got one that's come through already. If I could just remind everybody to pop those questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat box, that would be helpful. So someone has asked, Gary, are there any general differences you come across when helping women versus men?
Women's teams are very different to men's teams. Young women are very different collectively to young men, in my opinion. I would say the big difference with working with women and working with men is women want to work with each other. women are fearful, in my experience, I know this is a generalization, they're fearful of being different from other women. They identify with other women and do not want to be excluded from the group. Men, it doesn't bother them at all. Men want to be different from each other and stand out. Everybody wants to be either the goal scorer or the goalkeeper or the winger. Difference is very important for men and very, very striking, whereas women want to be often coalesce with each other. You often get a lot more camaraderie in women's teams and men's teams. And there's a whole issue around relationships. I mean, for example, the LGBTQ community is a lot more there's a lot more acceptance of it in the women's game than the men's game. We haven't got apparently a gay footballer, a gay male footballer, which is ridiculous. Nobody's had the ability to come out or the honesty to come out. So those issues are much more honest inside the women's game. And then you have the whole issue around menstrual cycles and what happens to women's form with those issues. Ligament laxity during menstrual cycles is an issue, which I know is being looked at by sports science people. So there are very different issues that I probably don't know an awful lot about, but I'm aware of. But psychologically, I'd say much more cohesion inside women's teams and men's teams.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary. Laura's asked, given the Rugby League World Cup coming up, how would you treat a team of individuals if you were helping them for the first time?
Okay, great question, Laura. If I was working with people for the first time, I would probably try to break down some of the barriers whereby we have a personal history session, whereby, because when people come into a group for the first time, it's a bit tricky. It's really tricky. And I think it was Norman Trippett, was the psychologist who came up with a theory of how groups evolve around forming, storming, norming, and then performing. I don't know if you've come across this stuff before, but the forming is the forming of the group come together. Storming is when people get quite angry with each other and cross with each other and have rows and arguments. Then the norming is everybody agrees a basic set of rules. We're all going to play by do the same thing. And then performing is when they obviously perform and get what they're doing correctly. But the forming stage right at the start of that is really, really important. And I would have, if it was me, I'd have a personal history session whereby people would tell each other where they came from. What was their personal history? Were they going through a difficult time? Were they going through, had they been injured recently? Are they coming back from injury? Are they married? Are they divorced? Are they in a marriage break? All those sort of things. And then we know each other. It all makes sense. Because if we haven't got that stuff, people are just strangers. So that would be my first thing, Laura. Have a personal history. Everybody speaks for 5 minutes about who they are, why they're there.
Fab. Thanks, Gary. Next question from Charlotte. Can you give some examples of how you build that confident self-belief again, or feed the good wolf?
How do you feed the good wolf? Well, there's lots of different techniques. Very often it's something called, which is a sports psychology technique, by the way, a self-talk. You talk to yourself, come on, you can do this, all that sort of stuff. And also recognize when you're feeding the bad wolf. Somebody called it a toxic cocktail. Do you really, would you really want to go down that path? Well, we can all do it. We can all, because I only realized this till relatively recently, when we are in the midst of a difficult psychological problem, we take our past experiences, and if we don't know what's going on, we fill in the gaps. And usually those gaps are miles and miles off the truth.
Create their own narrative.
Creating your own narrative is feeding the bad wolf.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's just for example, I've been injured. I've done my knee twice. The narrative is I'm going to do it again. There's feeding the bad wolf. Stop it. Recognize you're doing it. Maybe you know, right on your wrist, on your Stereosport bandage. Don't feed the bad wolf, because ultimately, if you feed that, it'll get stronger.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have an animal or a pet, you feed them, they'll get stronger, like anything. And it's the same with the good wolf and the bad wolf.
And I guess that's, you know, relevant to everybody, isn't it? Not just in the kind of sporting environment. Anders has asked, how do you build the trust that is sought after from players, as you mentioned? So what was your response to that player when he asked?
Yeah, okay, right, I'm with you. Do you know, I can't remember, if I'm honest. I asked him what his fear was, and he was very honest about what his fear was.
Mm-hmm.
And we made a contract with each other. And I said, I contract with you that I will not, this is an entirely confidential conversation. And if at any stage you feel I have betrayed that confidence, you must come to me and have that conversation. And I said, I'm going to also say to you, there are a set of contracts I'd like to build in with you. For example, honesty with each other. There's a concept in psychology called radical candor, which I'm a big fan of. And my people I work with say this is something that they quite like about my work. I'm just incredibly straight with people. And I will tell people if I'm really unhappy with something that they believe in, or I'll cut across and say that's not helpful. We have to stop this. This has to stop. Because some therapists, I think the concept is for people like me is we're touchy-feely, everything's fine, everything's cool, everything's okay. No. Because in sports clubs, it's not like that. We can't slam and ridicule and be rude about our players, and we can't say everything's okay, you come to training late, it's fine, you know, you haven't done your reps yet. No, we have to find a midway point. We have to find that point where sporting excellence exists. It's not about screaming and shouting at your players if they're not doing the right thing. It's not about saying it's okay, don't worry, you've lost your boots, you know, blah blah blah. We have to have structure, we have to have discipline, but it lives in between these two sides.
Mm-hmm. And Gary, do you sign any NDAs, or does it kind of just still sit within that patient confidentiality?
My NDAs are come verbally from me.
They're verbally, okay.
I will not, I promise I will not. But there are, right, I mean, you ask a really good question, to be honest, Serena, a really good question. Because sometimes you have to break that wall. Mm-hmm. Let me give you, for instance, I was working at a football club, and a young lad comes to see me, and he's wearing a pink bib, and written on the pink bib are the words, I am SHIT. I said, why are you wearing that bib? The worst trainer of the week has to wear this bib. And he had to wear pink socks and a pink bib. So there was a whole sort of homophobic thing going on anyway, and he admitted that. And I went to I knew that the club would be in trouble if that persisted. So I asked his permission, can I go and challenge this way of doing the worst trainer of the week thing? He said, yeah, if you want. I got his permission. And I went to the managing director and said, we can't do this. This is just out of the 1980s. Mm-hmm. The pink bib went, the pink socks went. And but I had to challenge that because fundamentally, I knew what was going on was wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if something's wrong, I have to break that confidentiality, but usually with the permission of the person who also knows it's wrong as well.
Yeah. Would it not be easier just to do a written NDA rather than a verbal? Because, you know, if that's then broken, they've got that written.
Sometimes some therapists do that. I think.
Do they? Okay.
I like to think I'm relational insofar as how people find me.
Yeah.
And If they want a written NDA, I'll do that. But I mean,
Normally
my
it's
word's my
verbal.
bond.
Yeah. Perfect. Thanks, Gary. Abby's asked, how did you attain your title as a psychotherapist? What qualifications, events did you undertake?
What was the last bit again? Which?
Events, qualifications / events, presume maybe courses.
Yeah, so I have held a postgraduate diploma in psychotherapy. I studied for 5 years at a training school called Bridge Pastoral Foundation. It was a postgraduate diploma, and the events I went to a clinic in Harley Street in London, and they gave me a whole stream of sports clients to work with. And it was then I was invited into the football club when the manager reached out and said, "Would you come and work with us?"
Brilliant. What was your undergraduate degree in?
That was in English.
In English?
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. Someone else has asked, what do you recommend for, say, the physio or other support staff who may find themselves experiencing a similar unexplainable loss of form in their work, their capabilities, etc.? How to address that?
Is that the physio and support staff are finding a drop off in their work?
Yeah.
Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, similar unexplainable loss.
Well, I'm not sure that's the question, so I'm going to answer both sides of it. If you're working with a player and you think that player is not doing what they should be doing, you need to challenge that. And one of the lovely things that I think I managed to create inside my football club is I can't be there 24/7 looking at every player in every circumstance in every room, but there are people there who are my eyes and ears. Be the eyes and ears, be that person who is curious about why players that you are treating are having a drop off in form, because there's a reason. There has to be a reason. There always is a reason. So be curious. If you are finding your work is dropping off in quality, be curious again. Ask yourself why. Are you motivated? What's stopping you being the best version of yourself? Are you in the right profession? Are you disillusioned? Do you really want to do another job? Do you find somebody else's job a bit more interesting than yours? So again, I would say be curious and find out why you're finding there's a drop off in your work, because there shouldn't be. Be the best version of yourself at any given time.
That person that asked, Dr. Diallo, has said yes, the physio in her or his work, loss of form and loss of confidence in their work for whatever reason. So I think you've answered that.
And you know, sometimes people just need a break. Sometimes people just need some time off.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Absolutely. We've got, by the looks of it, 3 more questions to get through, Gary, and then we'll probably finish up. So someone has asked, you talk about feeling the good wolf and the opposite for the bad wolf. Does that not result in someone who's too cocky and has an overinflated opinion of themselves?
By feeding the bad wolf or feeding the good wolf? I don't know.
By feeding the good wolf.
No, good wolf is about empathy. Good wolf is about kindness. Good wolf is about doing the right thing. Do the right thing. You know, in every given situation, however tempting it is, just do the right thing. That's the good wolf. The bad wolf is doing the wrong thing. You know what the right thing is.
Yeah, so it's not kind of, you know, creating this big ego. That's not what the good wolf is about.
It's about being kind and thoughtful to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Danielle has asked, going back to the story about the pink bib and the socks being wrong, how do you approach the right staff members about that situation? How do you make the decision to approach the staff in the first place? When do you know if you are not overstepping your role?
Do the right thing. You know that's wrong.
Yeah.
If you don't know that's wrong, you know, it's a bit like explaining why night follows day. It's going to get light tomorrow morning. If you're struggling with that stuff, I would argue maybe it's time to look at another profession. You have to pick the right person. You have to pick the right person inside the organization, because if you think about this, and this is what my thought process is, I'll share with you. I didn't want the football club in a few years' time to be held up and ridiculed, or taken to a tribunal. And remember, my client is not the players, it's not the manager, it's not the staff, it's the football club. And I'm holding in mind the reputation of the football club all the time. What does the football club need from me? Now, the player might need something different, manager might need something different. But if that goes against what the football club needs from me, then there's sometimes a conflict of interest, and that has to be sorted out. And yeah, I just have to be honest and say I can't work with an individual. I'll give you a very quick, for instance, I was working with an academy manager. He was looking after the sort of kids, and he got in dispute with the football club. It went to litigation, and he wanted me to work with him as his therapist whilst he took the club to litigation. So that's a conflict of interest. I've got the football club in my mind. I can't work with you if you're taking the football club to litigation. You need your own therapist.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gary. Last question on here, and I think you've kind of answered it already. From D, is there any point in which you break the NDA and have to speak to a physiotherapist about the patient you're speaking to? For example, they tell you that they're exaggerating an injury, etc., or safeguarding issues.
Safeguarding issues you have to report. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
They are talking about feeling unsafe. They are talking about damaging themselves or damaging somebody else. If there's sexual exploitation of minors, you have to report that. Oh, there should be no doubt at all. If they're exaggerating an injury, I don't want to know why. That's not a safeguarding issue.
Yeah.
If young people are involved, and the welfare of young people are involved, or you feel somebody is being put at risk by somebody else's lack of care and concern, that's a safeguarding risk. You have to report it, because if you don't report it and it goes into a bigger problem, you would be the person who the finger would be pointed at. If I have a safeguarding risk, and I've had one today, reported it every time. Yeah.
So things like exaggerating injury is, that wouldn't be a reason to break an NDA at all. That's your role.
I'd ask the athlete why they were exaggerating the injury.
Yeah.
Did they really want to play? Did they really want to get back in the first team? Why? Be curious, be detectives.
And do the right thing.
And do the right thing. Every time, do the right thing.
Brilliant.
Because then nobody can point your finger at you and say, he's compromised.
Yeah.
And that's hopefully why I'm carrying on doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
If anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm very happy to answer questions. My email address is gary.bloom@btinternet.com. That's gary.bloom@btinternet.com. I also have a website. You can contact me through there, garybloom.co.uk.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Gary. That was really, really valuable. Any final thoughts from you, Gary or Andrew?
Just say thanks very much, Gary. I read Steve Peters' book a few years ago, and personally find it really useful to sometimes just apply the more logical side of your brain when you need to. And also what you were saying about the coaching of younger players. I know my kids are 11 and 9, and I help out with coaching their sport, but I know there will come a point when having dad there coaching them isn't the best for their sort of well-being or performance. So I know that the RFU have got some really strong evidence now in rugby coaching to say that at a teenage age it's better for the group if there's not parents coaches, and the kids will respond better to having a sort of a proper coach. So if
there's any mums and dads on the call, think of it this way. Would you say to your child, I don't think the maths teacher's teaching the right thing today, it's all rubbish. Don't think the geography teachers are up to much, but you do it every Sunday up the side of the pitch, don't you? Leave the coaches alone. You don't go into school and hammer the maths teacher. You don't go into school and hammer the geography teacher. Don't hammer the coaches. They've got their badges, they've got their qualifications. And never, and if your kid says to you, Daddy, how did I play today? You say to them, just ask your coach, because I'm not qualified to answer that question.
Yeah, I think it's that balance between parent and coach, which is a hard one to tread if you're trying to wear both hats. But yeah, it's good. And yeah, really like the idea of the tape with the motto or self belief on. So we'll definitely be pushing that one. But no, thanks very much for joining, and thanks very much, Gary, for a brilliant talk. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
You've got quite a few people, Gary, in the chat box saying thank you as well.
Yeah.
Once I end the call, we won't be able to retrieve those, so you can have a look through. So I will end the call. Like I said before, this recording will be available and will be sent out over the next few weeks, and certificates of attendance, so no need to email us. Thank you all for joining tonight, and again, massive thank you to Gary for freeing up his evening after a difficult day. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Serena. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.